Hello. In this series of short talks, I will touch on themes which came to light as I was writing my PhD and later my book on the tensions in the Russian Church in the postmodern world. We refer to these global conflicts as the culture wars, a term which harkens back, perhaps with good reason, to the Bismarckian Kulturkampf of the 19th century. Here I am not so much concerned with the contemporary clash of beliefs and attitudes as with the deep origins of the current malaise. Each episode will focus on one or two manifestations of the culture wars, its interconnectedness with seemingly unrelated topics, and its origins in the mist of time. Each talk is not designed to give any kind of in-depth or exhaustive treatment of these vast intertwined themes, but instead to prick the casual listener's curiosity to explore the seminal texts and beyond to lesser-known works. The purpose in effect is to stimulate thought on these issues. In this first talk, I will look at a manifestation which is so all-pervasive as to affect practically every area of public life. This is the elevation of victim, grievance, or slave morality into the gold standard of ethics everywhere and not only in the West. Accompanying it is an applied emotivism based on disgust or approval. It is impossible to understand today's culture wars without an understanding of the genealogy of today's flamboyant and very public morality obsession. The most obvious manifestation of grievance morality is today's so-called virtue signalling and virtue shaming. Behind this spectacle-oriented ethics lies an ever-changing hierarchy of grievance, which, it is supposed, connects in a kind of web of grudges across a vast plethora of real and imagined injustices, past and present. Some people have called this intersectionality. In a broad sense, this works along the age-old principle that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, combined with a new system of values based on the oppressor-victim dichotomy. Today's hegemonic victim moralities are directed to one or another oppressor group, and these oppressor bullies are ever-changing and many, ranging from whole countries and geopolitical concepts such as colonialism, Russia, China, the USA, Israel, and the West, to white men, all men, straight people, Christians, and even old-school feminists, TERFs. It is because grievance morality has such deep roots that it is sometimes difficult to see what a massive revolution it represents from previous ethical systems. Yet if we compare today's moral universe with that of ancient Rome, it immediately becomes obvious that the ancients would have considered it an insanity of the highest order. One only needs to look at Roman victory arches, gloriously covered with their tribute carried by defeated and enslaved peoples, to realize that victimhood was not an elevated status. The elevation of victimhood has given rise to today's ever more febrile and polarized public space, all of it ultimately concerned with the acquisition of power. Nowadays, if you want power, you had better prove either your virtue by your victimhood oppressed status or your enlightened self-hatred as an oppressor. This dynamic is in a constant state of flux. An oppressor might be transformed into a victim in the blink of an eye, so it is good to keep one's wits about one. I myself wondered recently that if the Second World War happened today, we would very soon see mass Stop the War marches in London. This would probably happen after the USA entered the war, and most assuredly after the German defeat at Stalingrad, from which point on the Nazis were the underdog, if ever there was one. But what does the elevation of the victim mean in an applied sense? In order to understand this, it is useful to analyse the great exponent of the slave-master moral paradigm, Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche proposed two moralities, that of the master, the eagle, which was freely given and noble, not concerned with utilitarian betterment, but whose morality was instead a gift and not a necessity. The morality of the slave, the lamb, on the other hand, was based on necessity, weakness, moving with the herd, and above all, resentment or grievance. Consequently, Nietzsche loathed democracy, the herd morality of resentment and utilitarian gain, and even more Christianity, which he saw as a feminized and slave moral universe full of emotional outrage. Because the lambs, or as Nietzsche calls them, cellar rats full of revenge and hatred, do not have power over the eagle, They play a trick on him, and their trick is virtue, guilt. They cloak their resentment in the mantle of goodness, love and justice. The great German theorist Carl Schmitt brilliantly dismantled the post-war obsession with human rights and war crimes as a cloak behind which to hide the annihilation and dehumanization of the defeated. He works in a similar way in this regard to Nietzsche. Nietzsche's critique of slave morality seems especially prescient today. We only need to look at today's elevation of justice, from the myriad international tribunals and courts down to the individual social justice warrior. It is like a demonic outgrowth from the Christian past, and well pales to think at the opprobrium Nietzsche would have heaped upon it. The hunt for supposed oppressors and the elevation of supposed victims permeates every sphere of public life. The application of resentment-based victim morality is hyper-emotivism. Public debate no longer happens along the lines of people making arguments, invoking long and complex histories, and making a case. Instead, people appear and scream about civilian deaths and oppressors without any context or any attempt to make a case, and this happens ad nauseum. I believe this to be connected to the elevation of outrage and the denigration of self-control, which is at the heart of a resentment-based morality. The media and all public space has thus become a white light of a billion screams, with almost no reasoned debate, no context, no history, and no analysis. Alistair MacIntyre brilliantly exposed the pitfalls of moral emotivism in his book After Virtue, 1981, and his subsequent texts. According to emotivism, moral judgments are simply expressions of approval or disgust and nothing more. This makes the ground on which they stand extremely insecure and shifting. Nevertheless, such emotivism elevates these reactions into the gold standard of moralizing principles. A practical result of this is that reasoned debate no longer has any clout in the public sphere. What is important is who can clean the most approval, virtue signalling, or disgust, shaming. The aim is to hit the recipient in the hypothalamus, bypassing the frontal lobe. In practice it works like this. I show you a picture of dead children, supposedly killed by an Israeli or a Russian bomb. This silences all debate about Israel's war against Hamas or Russia's war in Ukraine. Similarly, I show you a picture of a dead migrant baby on the beach at Dover, and this means that any border controls are evil. So it goes on and on. The reason why emotivism fits so well together with slave morality is that they have a great deal in common. The outraged cry of the lamb is emotive. Likewise, resentment, anger, empathy, in fact all of the slave virtues are of emotional origin. For Nietzsche, the rise and eventual victory of slave morality was due to the spread of Judeo-Christianity. It was the democratic imputation of the new faith, which disregarded rank and honour and addressed itself to all men, and even women and slaves, which was diametrically opposed to the military hierarchy of Rome. Many besides Nietzsche have thus laid at the door of Christianity the demise of the Roman Empire and its gradual erosion of civic duty and inability to counter the barbarian and finally the Muslim invasions. Everything I have said so far would imply that I think that Nietzsche was right, and in a sense he was. It is true that the rise of Christianity changes everything, and one of the deepest and world-shaking transformations was the change in the role and influence of women and the feminine in society. Natural female attributes such as compassion, meekness and mercy were elevated, and male ones such as bravery in war and the striving for glory, thymos, were demoted. At the same time, it is without doubt that the Roman military and hierarchical ideas continued on in the Christian Empire. We only need to consider Justinian's brutal and successful wars against barbarians and heretics, which laid waste to vast areas of Italy and North Africa. Later, Christians fought a heroic struggle against Islam, often on the retreat, but with dogged tenacity. For hundreds of years, Christians would square the Sermon on the Mount with the reality of hierarchies and the sword in a sophisticated balance of personal moral calling versus pragmatic realities of daily life and natural law. The threat of Islam was to present a huge challenge. The difference was that Islam was founded on and for war and conquest. Its aim was, and still is, to subject the entire world to Islam by any means possible, including the sword. Thus Islam tapped into the master-slave dichotomy with aplomb. Christians under Islam were, and still are, subject to all manner of horrors, but they were able to elevate this disaster as martyric. Anti-Christian apologists would propose that the subservient dimitude of Christians was actually their natural state. They developed a kind of Stockholm syndrome with their Islamic oppressors. To the outside, it could look like a win-win situation. Feminine Christianity could elevate its revenge-based victim morality under the yoke of its masculine master, Islam. When God died in the West, the slave morality, as with so much else, remained. It was no longer anchored in the solely personal moral universe, but was transformed into a very public ethic. The advent of the global media revolution then resulted in a truly exponential growth in victim-based ethics. So was Nietzsche right? When we look at the people-pleasing smiles of the likes of Justin Welby and Francis Bergoglio, we can see that the trick of the lamb in their supposed meekness. But I believe that this caricature of Christian morality to be a distortion of the complex calling of the Christian life. G.K. Chesterton put it most succinctly in this famous passage from his book on orthodoxy. The modern world is not evil. In some ways, the modern world is far too good. It is full of wild and wasted virtues. When a religious system is shattered, as Christianity was shattered at the Reformation, it is not merely the vices that are let loose. The vices are indeed let loose, and they wander and do damage. But the virtues are let loose also, and the virtues wander more wildly, and the virtues do more terrible damage. The modern world is full of all the Christian virtues gone mad. The virtues have gone mad because they have been isolated from each other and are wandering alone. Some scientists care for truth, and their truth is pitiless. Thus some humanitarians only care for pity, and their pity, I am sorry to say, is untruthful. If all there was to Christian morality was the culture of being nice and campaigning for justice for the oppressed, both of which are ubiquitous in the West now, then Nietzsche's assessment would stand. Where I believe that Nietzsche was wrong was in his assessment of Christianity as a slave ideology, and only that. In fact, Christian morality, as in all things, chose the still more difficult path, the middle way, the royal way, because every master is not truly free if he is a slave to his passions, a slave to sin. As St. Augustine said, a man has as many masters as he has vices. This side of Christian morality is indeed the morality of the master. Master morality is not vindictive. A master who is vengeful and vindictive is actually a slave. It is slave morality that is vindictive, full of seething vengefulness against oppressors. Yes, Christianity is the religion of mercy and of Mother Teresa and of Saint Elisa Fyodorovna, but it is also the religion of countless warrior kings, including Saints Constantine and Justinian. It is the absolute duty of a Christian ruler to defend his people against the infidel invader, and not to make a pact with them out of expediency, reducing them to dimitude. Moreover, the flaws in Nietzsche's paradigm become evident as one starts to look more closely. The master is, in a sense, always at the mercy of the power of the mob, the herd, with whom he must compromise in order to retain power. Also, the eagle has compassion on its weak and helpless offspring, defending them to the death. In regards to the demise of Rome, it could be argued that one of the prime causes was the demographic crisis, at least in part a result of the denigration of women. After all, women give birth to and raise warriors. Finally, is not today's obsession with public virtue actually the antithesis of Judeo-Christian morality? As our Lord said, those who promote themselves in this way have already had their reward. Where your treasure is, there is your heart. Perhaps the problem in Nietzsche's paradigm are best revealed in the character of Nietzsche himself, whose deep sensitivity is revealed in his final outpouring of empathy towards a suffering horse being flogged, just before he went insane. So Nietzsche's critique is highly simplistic, yet in its caustic assessment of a certain perversion of Christian morality, it still stands as a brilliant warning. Nietzsche was astute at unmasking the mercenary imperatives behind so much of today's morality, in which the supposed virtues of meekness and kindness form part of a self-serving and utilitarian game. Paradoxically, his critique offers an interesting examination of conscience, for the Christian embarking upon the spiritual life.